All right. So I'm guessing that a lot of you are new to the Noah Webster House and West Hartford Historical Society. So I'll just take a second to tell you a little bit about who we are. We're a not-for-profit museum, and we're dedicated to preserving and sharing the birthplace of Noah Webster, as well as his legacy and the evolving history of the town in which he grew up, which is West Hartford, Connecticut. So Noah Webster is best known for writing the American Dictionary of the English Language, which is what today's Merriam-Webster Dictionary is based upon. And he wrote that in 1828. But he actually is considered to be an American founding father, as someone who created the American English that we still use today. And we're very pleased to have his birthplace here in West Hartford, Connecticut. And he was around during the founding of the country. He actually wrote a book called Sketches of American Policy that was written before the Constitution and was widely read by the members of the Continental Congress. So I'm curious to hear Dr. Zaino's book about this period of time. And of course, in my mind, I'm thinking about how Noah Webster might have been also talking about a lot of these conversations with the people that he knew. So let me tell you a little bit about the book, and maybe many of you have already read it, American Democracy in Crisis, The Case for Rethinking Madisonian Government. Professor Zaino says, public disenchantment with and distrust of government is at an all-time high. In the face of widespread challenges, everything from record levels of debt and the sky-high cost of education to gun violence, racial discrimination, an immigration crisis, overpriced pharmaceuticals, a pandemic, and much more. Boy, I know that sounds really bad, doesn't it? The government seems paralyzed and unable to act. And in her book, Professor Zaino will explain why we are in this situation, why the government is unable to respond to key challenges, and most importantly, what we can do about it. I'm so pleased to have Dr. Zaino from Iona College, where she's a professor of political science and international studies. She has a strong pedigree in political science with a master's degree from the University of Connecticut and a master's and doctorate from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Dr. Zaino has over 25 years of experience in the field and has published several articles and books on various political topics. Beyond her work in print, she is a frequent contributor on Bloomberg TV and radio, as well as several other media outlets. So thank you very much for joining us, Professor Zaino, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So last night I was flipping through the news, as I do frequently, and I came across Rachel Maddow's show that some of you may see on MSNBC. And she was talking about the fact that just yesterday, President Biden was out in the West in looking at the damage caused by the tremendous wildfires out there. And he was talking about, of all things, a shortage of fire hoses. Apparently, as a result of the pandemic, which has wreaked havoc on our supply chain, and as somebody who just lost her car to the storm Ida and has to unfortunately go shopping for a new one, I could tell you firsthand, the supply chain has impacted a lot of things, from computer chips to automobiles to paper. And yes, the president told us yesterday, fire hoses. So as a result, he said he was going to invoke the Defense Production Act. This is this law that allows the president and the government to take over a private business to produce things that the country needs. He did it for the first time, as you may remember, in terms of the COVID vaccines. And now for the second time, he said yesterday, he's going to do it to produce and manufacture 22,000 hoses. And in talking about this, and let me see if I can share my screen for a minute, Rachel Maddow said the following.
The biggest picture of all, President Biden keeps saying that what he feels like he needs to prove to the world right now is that US government can work, is that democracy can work, that our representational system of government can work, and the federal government has the authority it needs to solve problems large and small.
And Rachel Maddow is right about that. The president has been saying, but since before he came into office as a candidate, that his number one goal is to prove to the world, particularly the autocracies around the world, China being the primary among them, that our system of government can work, it can produce, it can deliver, and it can solve problems. It is a worthy goal. It's a goal that almost every president we've had has shared. There's no problem with the goal. The issue is achieving it. And in this case, for somebody like Joe Biden or any president in our system, it's a little bit like trying to push a boulder up the hill, because making our system work is going to be incredibly difficult, even if he has the power of the presidency behind him, which he does, and even if he has the will, which he clearly does. And so what my book is about, and what I want to talk to you a little bit about tonight, is why that is. Why is it so difficult in our system to make the government work? And it really boils down to three words. It's the system. It's the system, the way it was designed by the founders. And Jen was just talking about Noah Webster as one of the founding fathers. We also have founding mothers we don't hear as much about. But it is the system that they created. And it's a system in which we live. And unfortunately, it's a system that was not designed to work in the way some people, not everybody, but some people today may hope it works. So to understand sort of the context of this, I want to go back a little bit. There's probably no more colorful figure in American politics than Theodore Roosevelt. And if you've ever had a chance to read Candace Millar's River of Doubt, you know what I'm talking about. This is a man who, after losing the 1912 election, decided to trek down the Amazon River and nearly lost his life. And so years ago, when I heard that Theodore Roosevelt had decided to write a biography about a founder who many of us aren't familiar with, a gentleman from New York named Gouverneur Morris, I couldn't imagine what it was he saw in Gouverneur Morris. And then when I read the biography and read that he described Gouverneur Morris as brilliant, but lacking in self-control, that really struck me. Because if you know anything about Theodore Roosevelt, to be described like that by Theodore Roosevelt, I wondered, what had Gouverneur Morris, as his name is, done to deserve that kind of description? Brilliant, but lacking in self-control. And the more I got to know about Gouverneur Morris, the more it proved to be true. Another biographer described him as the rake who wrote the Constitution. And of course, rake is a dated term, but it really means a womanizer, somebody who's sort of a hellraiser. And Gouverneur Morris was all of those things. He famously carried on a 3-year affair with a woman in the Louvre before it became the Louvre in Paris on assignment. In his late 50s, he married for the first time one of his housekeepers, 22 years younger than he was, and accused of murdering her own child. And he also knew something about physical pain. As a young man, he had been scalded by water so badly that he lost a year of schooling. A few years later, he fell from a carriage, and his doctor being out of town, he was given another doctor to fill in. This doctor promptly said his leg had to be amputated, and it was. And then his doctor returned a few days later and said the amputation wasn't necessary. Morris took it all in stride, and actually what we understand, a good deal of humor. He used to like to tell people he lost his leg jumping out of his lover's window because he thought the real story was boring. He also suffered towards the end of his life. He got a horrible infection and decided to try to treat it by himself by using a whale bone as a catheter, and he ultimately died as a result of that. Something you never want to try that Gouverneur Morris did. For all his pain and suffering, and there was a lot of physical pain in his life, he also had a huge outsized impact on the founding of the United States, the founding of the state of New York, and the founding of New York City. James Madison is often described as the father of our Constitution, but in fact, Gouverneur Morris is known as the penman of our Constitution because an incredibly gifted writer, he wrote substantial portions of the document and rewrote substantial portions that Madison put into place initially. In fact, He wrote the 7 most famous words in American political history, the preamble to the Constitution. And so it was, I think, a combination of these factors, both his intimate understanding of the fragility of the human body and the body politic, and his tremendous writing skills, that when I sat down to write this book, I kept reflecting on something that he said to a friend just before he died. And let me see if I could put this up. And Jen, if you can just tell me if it's not showing, it should be the first slide if it's not showing, trying to show it.
It looks good.
Okay. Gouverneur Morris, just before his death, wrote to a friend about the Constitution. And he said, "Nothing human can be perfect. Surrounded by difficulties, we did the best we could, leaving it to those who should come after us to take counsel from experience and exercise prudently the power of amendment, which we had provided." And that idea that the Constitution, as it was constructed by the framers 234 years ago, it was adopted actually on Friday. They understood, all of them, from Gouverneur Morris to Alexander Hamilton to Thomas Jefferson, who famously wasn't even at the convention, to George Washington and everybody else in between, James Madison included, that during the convention, they had made difficult choices. They had compromised a good deal. They had come out with a document that was the result of compromising from 13 diverse interests, because of course the delegates were representing states. And that the document they had put together, as Alexander Hamilton famously says at the end of the Federalist Papers, it was remarkable, historic, and noteworthy, but far from perfect. We all know about many of those imperfections. Probably the most famous and arguably one that the framers bear the most shame for was the 3/5 compromise. The fact that they never extended the franchise, the vote, beyond white property owning males. Those are 2 critical examples of massive failures. But there are other difficulties with the document. There are other imperfections that the framers recognized at the convention and then very early in the founding, as the country was getting started. And these are difficulties that are even more insidious in some ways than the ones we're more familiar with. And I describe them as more insidious because they impact all of our lives today. And yet they have never garnered the kind of public attention or notice. And when they have, they haven't been acted on. And these are what I call the structural difficulties with the Constitution. And these are the difficulties that, whatever their merit in 1787, they really impede our ability to have a government that's responsive to the majority and that is accountable. A government that, to borrow Joe Biden's phrase, can work. And so let me give you one of the many examples of this. This is somebody probably many of you won't recognize. This is former Treasury Secretary C. Douglas Dillon. In 1982, he was asked to deliver a commencement address at Tufts University. And the focus of his talk, which became famous, was that the government in 1982, and for many decades before, was unable to address critical problems facing the country. And as you reread this speech today, it is remarkable how many of those issues that he's talking about that the government wasn't addressing in 82 remain with us today. But one in particular is gun violence. Dillon talked a lot about the fact that the government in 1982 had yet to address the crisis of gun violence that he described was plaguing the nation. And he said what was more remarkable is they weren't addressing it, despite the fact that polls at the time showed that 75% of Americans supported common sense gun control. That was 1982. In the 40 years since he spoke, America has experienced 14 of the 15 deadliest shootings in modern history. The Las Vegas killing at the music festival, killing 58 people. The 2016 massacre at the Orlando nightclub. The shootings at Virginia Tech. And of course, the shootings at Sandy Hook in Connecticut, where Noah Webster's house is, Noah Webster's home, killing babies. And despite all of that, we have not had sustained action on gun control. And Dylan was correct 40 years ago, as you would be today, to say that no sustained action at the federal level, despite the fact that vast majorities of Americans agree with basic common sense gun control. And you could substitute in gun control for a variety of other issues. And when you ask people why the government has failed to act, you hear a variety of arguments, and many of them are true, or there's at least some truth to many of them. Things like interest groups, money in our politics, partisanship, corruption, the fact that we, unlike in the past, we elect, stupid people. If you talk to political scientists, I'll tell you one of the common ideas out there is that we, the people, are pretty uneducated about politics. We are sovereign, and yet we don't know enough to rule ourselves. So the system is doomed to fail. That's an argument that political scientists and social scientists have made for years. And there is data to back it up. All you need to do is look at a poll about how much people know about their own government. The results are deplorable. And so there is some truth to all of those factors, and I don't want to deny that. But one thing we don't hear enough about is the fact that the system is structured not to deliver. It's structured not to work. Of course, this is a takeoff, with all due respect to James Carville in the 1992 election. And I would have named my book this had the publisher allowed me. But this is what I would describe as one of the under-discussed, underappreciated reasons that these things are not getting done in our government. It's the system we live in. Some of you may be familiar with a management guru named Peter Drucker. And he used to say that if you are in an organization and you find that the organization is repeatedly subject to crises, in trouble, a malaise has come over it, he describes this as a symptom of systems failure. And it may be human nature that we tend to see systems failure, and maybe we hope that if we just keep replacing the people in the system, that somehow the system will correct itself. And so if you translate this into American politics or any political system, we keep hoping and praying that if we just get somebody smarter, somebody more moral, somebody better equipped, somebody really good in business, somebody really with a strong charismatic personality, if we just change the people in the system somehow, because they are so smart and good and whatever you want to describe them as, that the system will correct itself. But the fact is, that's unlikely to happen. And what Drucker says instead you should do, whether you're talking about a business organization or you're talking about a government, is it's a sign of systems failure. And usually that begins with the purpose or the object of the system. You've got to go back to the beginning. You've got to look, when this thing was designed, what was the object? What was the purpose? Because it's the object and the purpose that dictate the structure. And everything else that happens after that is going to be intimately tied to that structure. There are a lot of examples of systems failure, crises in modern American politics. And I don't have to tell any of you this, and Jen just went through a litany of examples. But here's another example. The National Election Study has, since the late 1950s, been conducting polls about how much Americans trust government. These are the results of the accumulation of these polls. and you can see them for yourself. From the late 1950s, when Americans, about 3/4 of Americans say they have trust in the federal government to do what's right almost all of the time, that number has now plummeted to 25%. That's 1/4 of Americans who trust their government. And that number has not gone over 30% since 2007. You'll notice the blip there on the screen just about 9/11, the anniversary we just celebrated. Of course, that was a blip due to patriotism of the time that descended very quickly. And there's a lot of complicated reasons that Americans don't trust their government. But if you see this as a problem, it makes sense to listen to what Drucker says and to try to go back to the beginning and to try to figure out what was the purpose of our system when it was constructed. What did they do then in structuring it? And do we still agree that that purpose makes sense today? And so as you think about our system of government, the object or the purpose of our system is very, very clear. It's protectionism. For our framers, the main object and goal of the government was protection, and particularly protection of liberty. There is nothing that our framers valued more than protection of liberty. And remember, liberty is not just freedom in general. Liberty is a specific kind of freedom. It's freedom from government. So the object and purpose of government is to protect our freedoms from government. And this picture is one that some of you may recognize. This is a picture of one of the incidents that really animated and energized the framers to get rid of our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and replace it with our current Constitution. Because don't forget, when we declared independence from Great Britain, we wrote a Constitution. That was the Articles of Confederation. It served us for about 10 years before it was replaced. And this is one of the events that drove the framers to replace the Articles. And Shays' Rebellion, as you may recall from American history, was the rebellion of farmers in Western Massachusetts. These were farmers who were struggling financially. They were being taxed by the time the war was over at a higher rate than they had been under the King of England. And with no means to pay those debts, the state began to take their farms away, foreclose on their businesses, jail them. And initially, the framers, led by Daniel Shays, tried to resolve the problem peacefully. When they couldn't do it, they decided to rebel. And at one point, they took up arms, marched to the armory in Springfield, Massachusetts, attempted to seize the weapons and overthrow their own government. They were not successful. They were put down, not by our federal government at the time, but by a mixture of state and private militia. That was one incident. There were many across the states at that time, a very, very famous one in Rhode Island as well. And those were the things that were at the top of James Madison's mind when he wrote the outlines of what would become our Constitution. Our federal government at the time was too weak to put down an insurrection, or what we might describe today as domestic terrorism. And the country was for that reason vulnerable. The government needed to be empowered enough to fight these kinds of majorities. And if you think about it, and of course, we always harken back to the Federalist Papers. What does Madison tell us in Federalist 10, the most famous of all Federalist Papers? He says the greatest danger to popular government is factions, particularly majority factions, groups animated by a shared interest that can threaten a minority. And for our framers, and for Madison, and he says this specifically in Federalist 10, what motivates factions more than anything? The unequal distribution of property, inequality. If you listen to the Sunday shows over this past weekend, you heard a very, very strong debate going on between people like Bernie Sanders on the one side and Joe Manchin on the other side. the senator from Vermont and the senator from West Virginia, both Democrats from very different parts of their party. And Bernie Sanders was talking repeatedly about the issue of inequality. When two people in the country, one of whom was just on the front page of the New York Times yesterday, own more wealth than the 40%, that's dramatic inequality. And this was a massive concern for the framers. Don't forget, our framers, as Charles Beard documented, were mostly all 55 white property owning men of wealth or fairly substantial wealth. They were concerned that if these types of majorities were able, as they started to in the 10 years or so we lived under the Articles, take over the state governments, what were they going to do? They were going to tyrannize property owners. They were going to tyrannize money interests. They were going to push for a redistribution of wealth. They were going to abolish their own debts. That's certainly what the farmers would have done. And so for Madison and the framers, they prized liberty. But at the top of that list was the liberty to own property. Don't forget, that's what John Locke said, right? That was what we replaced in the Declaration by happiness was actually property. We have a right to life, liberty, and we say property, or our framers did, but that was ripped off from John Locke and replaced what Locke described as property. And so when you believe that the purpose and the object of your government is protection of liberty, and for our framers, it was liberty of property, number one, what do? Well, what our framers do is they look to this man, Montesquieu, who 40 years before the founding wrote one of the great treatises in political theory, The Spirit of the Laws. Montesquieu said that that book damn near killed him, and he would never write again, he said after that, and he didn't. This was his last publication, but he didn't have to write anymore because he made quite an impact with this. And if you've read or want to reread Spirit of the Laws, what you'll uncover is he says something that the framers borrowed. The object and the purpose of government is the protection of liberty. And he comes up with an ingenious way to protect liberty. And that's what he describes as tres politica, separation of powers. If you want to protect your liberty from government intrusion, you separate power, you disperse power. And that's exactly what the framers did. I sometimes say they are Montesquieu on steroids. Montesquieu is talking about separation of powers, legislative, executive, judicial, the three branches we know today at the federal and the state levels. But what do? They add to that more division of power. They add to that bicameralism. They add to that federalism. They add to that checks and balances and a myriad of other divisions of power. And again, I want to be clear that for our framers, the purpose of a free state was the protection of liberty. And you may well believe that is still the goal and the object of government. But not everybody does. And if you don't believe the goal and the object of government or a free state is the protection of liberty, primarily, I mean, because we all believe in liberty, maybe you believe that the government should be serving the broader national interests. Maybe you believe that it should be creating citizens. There's a whole number of theories about what free governments can do and should be doing. But if you believe it should be doing something other than what our framers did, the design of this system as it is now is not going to work so well for you. And so the way I often describe it is that they prioritize liberty to such an extent that they neglect other principles of free states. Among them, things like responsiveness to the majority will, and accountability. In a Republican democracy, a republic, voters theoretically go to the polls and decide who they're going to support. In our system, it's hard to do that because the system is so divided, you almost don't know who's responsible for what and who you should hold accountable. Just theoretically, if Joe Biden is unable to deliver on his promise of infrastructure reform and you're a Democrat, do you really hold him responsible and throw him out of office in 2024 should he choose to run again? Or do you hold Senate Republicans in responsible? Or do you hold moderate Democrats like Joe Manchin responsible? There's a whole host of people you can hold responsible because the truth is the system is so diverse, it's hard to know who's accountable. And of course, we know our system is often not responsive. Not long ago, a professor, Tim Wu, who's a wonderful professor, wrote a piece in the New York Times you may have seen entitled "The Oppression of the Supermajority." And in it, he made a really important point. We in the media and everywhere, you hear around you that Americans are so divided and so polarized. And there's truth to that. We can't deny it is a polarizing time. But Tim Wu's point was when you look at the reality, there's a lot of things we agree on. And one question we don't ask enough is why aren't we making progress on things we agree on? Or why does it take a crisis to make progress on things we agree on? Infrastructure, which I just mentioned, being one of them. Very few people will tell you we don't need infrastructure reform. We've needed it for decades. If you go to any airport in this country, you know that. And yet it is taking this much effort. We are now just ending infrastructure summer. We are now into infrastructure fall, and we will see if we get a bill. It's still a precarious situation. And so if you believe that we want to still value liberty, but also increase, when I think of it, sometimes I think of it as the scales, increase responsiveness and accountability, there are ways in which you can do that. But it would require a restructuring of our system, not just replacing Donald Trump with Joe Biden or Joe Biden with anybody else or Nancy Pelosi with anybody else or, you know, Chuck Schumer with somebody else. You may get some changes around the edges, but you're not going to get the substantial change you may want if indeed you want change. If you ever watch Bill Maher, you know that he ends each of his shows or many of his shows with this thing he describes as a new rule. And not long ago, he did one of these, which he described as a new rule. And he said, the new rule was, you're not going to win the battle of the 21st century if you're a silly people, and Americans are silly people. And he ends it by saying that China is eating our lunch, particularly when it comes, and not exclusively, but particularly when it comes to issues like infrastructure reform. So I will share with you a little bit of what he had to say, and you'll excuse the language. Jen, just let me know if this doesn't play.
They're not a silly people. If anything, they are as serious as a prison fight. Look, we all know China does bad stuff. They break promises about Hong Kong autonomy, they put Uyghurs in camps and punish dissent. And we don't want to be that. But it's got to be something between authoritarian government that tells everyone what to do and a representative government that can't do anything at all. In 2 generations, China has built 500 entire cities from scratch, moved the majority of their huge population from poverty to the middle class, and mostly cornered the market in 5G and pharmaceuticals. Oh, and they bought Africa. Their new Silk Road initiative is the biggest infrastructure project in history, indebting not just that continent, but large parts of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East to the people who built their roads, bridges, and ports. If you want to go anywhere in the world these days, you better have a yen for travel. Yen for travel. stop it. In China alone, they have 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. America has none. Our fastest train is the tram that goes around the zoo. California wanted to build high-speed rail connecting the entire state, but alas, could not. We're $6 billion in the hole just trying to finish the track connecting the vital hubs of Bakersfield and Merced. One small step for nobody, one giant leap if you're a raisin. On a national level, we've been having Infrastructure Week every week since 2009, but we never do anything. Half.
And of course, he goes on to say that in the US, we see a problem, we ignore it, we lie about it, we fight about it, we litigate it, we sunset clause it, we kick it down the road, then we write a bill where a half-blanked solution doesn't kick in for 10 years. China sees a problem, they fix it. And he concludes by saying, we are not losing to China, we've lost. The returns just haven't come in yet. And of course, he was saying this a few months ago. We are now September and still in infrastructure, now fall. And he's right about the fact that China is far ahead of us when it comes to infrastructure and many other things. He's right about the fact that they are much more efficient, that they can act more quickly. But he's wrong about the reason. It's not because we're silly. It's not because we're stupid. It's not because we lack seriousness. It's because the way our system is structured, it makes it very, very difficult to get things done. And in fact, we used to say, and now during the pandemic, we're revisiting this, but we used to say the only time things get done in the United States is in a time of crisis. And what do you do when you build a system that only works in a time of crisis? You incentivize leaders to deem everything a crisis. And that's what we've done. We have wars on everything, wars on drugs, wars on terror, you name it. We've got a war on everything. Why? Because if you're a leader, if you don't describe it as a war, you're not going to make progress in our kind of system. There's really no shortage of remedies to this problem of our structural problems. Ever since the founding, very smart people have been offering up a host of remedies. You may recognize this. This is Woodrow Wilson. He is one of the only presidents who was a political scientist before he became president. So political scientists often feel quite warmly towards Woodrow Wilson for that reason. And he also is somebody who worked a great deal on this issue as a young man and then as an academic before he ascended to the presidency. And in addition to talking about specific remedies, which he did talk about, Wilson also focused a lot on how the changes would occur. What are the processes by which you would restructure this system? And the reality is there's only, well, there's three ways, only two of which any of us would want. Constitutional amendment, extra constitutional means, or violence. And of course, hopefully none of us want violence. So if you look at the constitutional avenues to change, you have two options. What we describe as the regular process to make amendments, the way that we've amended the Constitution 27 times, or the other way, and that's the Article 5 Constitutional Convention. We've never had another constitutional convention. For a variety of reasons, both constitutional amendment and a constitutional convention are really hard to imagine occurring in 2021 and in modern American politics. And so for that reason, and for a variety of other reasons, Woodrow Wilson and many other people who have thought about this have said, if you're going to make these kinds of changes, you're going to have to do them via extra constitutional means. Constitutional amendments require public energy. There's got to be a public push on Congress and their state legislatures to pass those amendments. And to get the public excited about something and energized, you have to be dealing with an issue that they care about, that they're passionate about, an issue that's moralistic, like abolishing slavery, an issue that deals with humanitarian challenges, an issue that's sexy, for lack of another word. Structural reforms are none of those things. They are what Wilson and many others described as contests of reason and leadership. They'll seldom move masses to action. And for that reason, constitutional amendments of either kind are almost completely off the table. And what we're left with are extra constitutional means to try to achieve these structural reforms. And so what do we mean by that? Changes to electoral laws and rules at the state and local level, changes to party rules, institutional reforms like the much discussed today, abolishing the filibuster. And of course, the return to first solutions, the return to responsible parties. And we call that a return to first solutions because that was the original solution our framers came up with. Don't forget, one of the great paradoxes of our system is that everyone from Madison to Jefferson to Washington in his farewell address was warning about the problem of parties and how dangerous parties were. And yet, immediately upon construction of our system, within 10 years, they turned to that very institution. And the reason they do is because we still, 234 years later, haven't come up with a better institution to make our system move forward. Now, that's not to say parties are not problematic. They are, and they have been. They have been prone to corruption and all kinds of challenges. But when you talk to a political scientist, they will tell you, it may not be the greatest institution in the world, but it's the best we have now. And one of my heroes, E.E. Schatzschneider, who taught at Wesleyan University and has since passed, he used to say the most important thing he did was he talked longer and harder and more passionately about political parties. Not because he had any love lost for political parties, but because if the system is structured in this way, if it is so divided in terms of power, there's no better way for us to try to make the government work. And so the danger here is that third solution I talked about. The danger here is if at some point you don't make the government work, if the government doesn't exercise power and get things done, resolve basic problems, like children being killed in their schools, like bridges and tunnels falling apart. At some point, the danger is that people turn to violence. And as we look at what's happened in the United States over the last 2 years, that doesn't seem as far-fetched as it might otherwise have seemed. In 1968, the New York Times asked a series of scholars and academics and public intellectuals this question. And of course, 1968 was a very violent year. They said, is America by nature a violent society? And there were a variety of responses. And you could see here, even on the left, Hannah Arendt, the incredible Hannah Arendt was one of the many people who wrote in response to this question. What many of them said, not all of them, but many of them said that violence is as American as apple pie. And we've never known real structural change in our system without it. And as depressing as that sounds, there is some truth to that. If you think about it, the framers would have understood that intimately. We are the children of people who threw off their own government violently because they said they had no other means to change the system. And then they wrote a constitution in which they included a process for constitutional structural change, the amendment process, because they wanted to avoid that in the future. Now, whether we can in fact use the amendment process, they may have made it too tough to use, but that was the purpose of amending it. And many people, many of us today think that anytime you write a constitution, of course you include amendment processes. That's not a big deal, but it wasn't always that way. You include an amendment process because you believe the document may need to change over time. And our framers did to a greater and lesser degree. Greater for Jefferson, not so much for Madison. But for anybody who thinks seriously about structural change to our system as being potentially necessary in the near or far future in the United States, this is the fear, that if we don't do it soberly and in a thinking manner, that it's going to come as the result of violence. And when a system stops working to the extent that a government isn't able to address the basic needs of its people, it is prone to collapse in violence. When the people can't look to their government to get things done, it's hard to blame them for looking for other solutions. And that's not to say we're there now, but there is a history which suggests that we are getting dangerously close to that point in the United States. And I'll just end on this. Friday, as I mentioned, is Constitution Day. It is the 234th anniversary of the birth of our nation. It is a federal holiday mandated that we at public institutions and private institutions that take federal dollars celebrate it, which is a little bit ironic, but that's the law. We at Iona will be celebrating it. But oftentimes, when you speak about the flaws in our system, the imperfections that Gouverneur Morris talked about, you are described as somehow unpatriotic. And I would implore you to be open to the idea that that is not the case. In fact, I don't think anything is further from the truth. Acknowledging the imperfections in the Constitution doesn't mean we love or celebrate it any less. In fact, I think it means you love and celebrate it more. And you take the framers' words seriously, that it needed to be cared for by subsequent generations if it was going to survive. They understood it was imperfect. Go back to Hamilton's last Federalist. He said, I'm not saying you should adopt this because it's perfect. I'm saying you should adopt it because it's the best we could do in a few months. And we're going to leave it to you via amendment and hopefully peacefully to change what needs to be changed over time. And I would just say that we all love things that are imperfect. My mother, who worked at the Noah Webster House for many years, she says she loves me and I'm imperfect. She says that at least, so I'm going to believe her. And so saying the Constitution is flawed and needs to be amended in some way, or we need to think about changing this structure in some way, is not an indication of anything but the deepest patriotism. And so, Jennifer, I hope I didn't go over time. I want to thank you so much and the West Hartford Historical Society, the Noah Webster House for sponsoring this. My old stomping grounds, I grew up in Farmington. I really appreciate it. And of course, thank you guys all for listening to this. It's quite a thing to have to do on a Tuesday night, the week of Constitution Day. But Jennifer, I'm happy to take questions if there's any time, and if anybody has any questions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Professor Zaino. I did write in the chat for everyone. If you have a question for Professor Zaino, please go ahead and put it in the chat and I will relay the message to the professor. Wait and see if anything comes in. Oh, well, I'll start off by asking you, Professor Zaino, where is a good place to purchase your book?
Should unmute myself.
Sorry. Oh, there we go.
Yep. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it from, it's published by Palgrave Macmillan, so you can get it there. It's pretty much available everywhere. It's an ebook. It's also hardcover. So it's available in all formats.
All right, so thank you so much. So we do have a question. It looks like Lisa has a question, but she's requesting that she can just ask you verbally. So I'm okay with that, Lisa. Go for it. Oops, let me mute.
Hey, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so it's overwhelming. Everything you say is amazing. I'm only on chapter 3. But so where does this leave us when you talk to your students? I mean, what do you suggest? It's just so much information, and overwhelming is all I can think of. So what kind of thing do you want to say to like the youth? I mean, what should we be doing?
So I think number one is having a conversation about what we think of as the purpose of our government. We just went through a 2020 election where even just if you focus on the Democratic side, there are very, very different views amongst the 20 plus or minus candidates out there. Everyone from Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders on the one side to people like Joe Biden and on the other side in terms of what the purpose of government is. And I think, I hope we all prize liberty. The question is, have we prized it so much that the government is not able to act, to do basic things? So I think one thing is thinking about, what do you think is the purpose of the government? I think protectionism is very important, but I also think that governments should be able to solve basic problems. Healthcare. I think a government should be responsive to the majority in a democracy. I think one big problem in our system is minorities have an outsized role, right? There is a reason that one person in the Senate or two people in the Senate, like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, can stop something that the party in power of which they are members wants to do. So I think one thing is having a conversation about the purpose of government. I think another big thing is not being as consumed, and I spend a lot of time in the media, with the media narrative that individuals are good or bad. We hear and we spend a lot of time talking about individuals. And if we just replace these people, things are going to get better. And that hasn't proven to be the case, and it likely won't. So I think, and it's important to know who you want to vote for and all of those things, and to support your parties and your candidates, but a little less focus on the individuals and a little more focus on the structure. And, I didn't say a lot about reforms, but the kind of reforms I'm generally talking about, and most people who think about this are talking about, are mitigating the divisions of power. So, for example, we have a division between the executive and the legislative branch. We can elect a president. Say Donald Trump, if you supported Donald Trump and you elected him, he promised to build a wall. He couldn't build that wall because he is not a part of Congress and they control the money. So one thing we want to think about is mitigating the divisions, particularly between the executive and the legislative branch. So one example, really basic, is allow the president to appoint a certain number of cabinet officials from the Senate. What does that do? It joins the Senate and the president together so that their electoral futures are codependent and they have an incentive to work together. The idea is to incentivize working together, to mitigate those divisions, right? So that's one example. Another example would be revisiting our historic disdain for political parties. Parties are problematic, but when they work, they do important things in government. They get things done. If our system wasn't this divided, I wouldn't be such a fan of responsible parties. But when you divide, you need an institution to bridge that gap. So those are the kinds of things I'm talking about. There's no easy solutions. I guess for me, it's important to say that I fear if we don't start to think in this way, that we will at some point be moved to a place where people do engage in an uprising, and it's going to be hard to blame them. So that's my fear, and we've seen it in American history. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
All right, Professor Zaino, we have another question from Sanford, who was wondering what has changed that we no longer are able to amend the Constitution?
Yeah, it's such a good question. We haven't had a lot of amendments in American history, if you think about it. We had 10, the Bill of Rights, immediately. Then we had the famous 11 through 15, which take us to the Civil War. But since the 1860s, 1870s, we've only had 12 amendments, and 2 of those canceled each other out. That would be prohibition and its removal. So since the Civil War, since the 1860s, 1870s, we've only amended 10 times. And that tells you how hard it is to do. Many of those amendments have been focused on things like civil liberties and civil rights, voting rights. What they haven't been focused on is structural reforms. So one of the things I talk about in the book is that only 7% of our amendments have been in the arena of serious structural reform. So one example would be direct election of senators, the 17th Amendment, right? There's only really been 2 serious structural amendments in American history. The reason it's so hard is that it was designed to be hard. And this was a debate that continued throughout the convention. Madison, on the one hand, wanted to give people a way to amend the Constitution, but he wanted to make it extremely difficult. You had other people who wanted to make it a little bit easier. And Madison simply, and people who supported him, won out. You know, to amend our Constitution requires unification of basically 3/4 of the states agreeing and majorities in the House, vast majorities in the House and Senate. And if you can think today of coming to that kind of agreement, it would have to be something so widely popular that it would move that many people in our system to support it. We haven't seen that since the 1990s. And don't forget, our last amendment, the 27th Amendment, was written by James Madison, and it was about not raising the pay of congressmen and women. That just didn't move through the process until the 1990s. That's the last time we amended. There's been so many attempts since then and before to amend, thousands of proposals put forward every year. They seldom gain any traction. I mean, I usually tell students that if somebody tells you they're going to runs for president, says they're going to do something via constitutional amendment, be very skeptical, right? Because it's probably not going to happen. So you've got to find another way. But to your question about the reason, because of the way they structured the amendment process, it's so hard to get it done and been done so seldom in American history. And some people I work with describe that as a real flaw in our system. And I have to say, I think there is some truth to that.
Thank you. So we have a question that's a little bit related from Rob, and he says, first of all, thank you. I think everyone is so impressed by your level of knowledge, Professor Zaino. You mentioned, Rob says, you mentioned that extra constitutional reforms could be made at the state and local level. And what kinds of reforms at that level do you think would be productive?
Such a good question. There's a ton of different ones that have been bandied about. Just to give you an example, after the 1968 Democratic Convention debacle in Chicago, for a variety of reasons driven by the Democrats who were responsible for that debacle, we moved to a system of primary elections as opposed to the way that we used to choose the nominees for our political parties. As you know, most of the states now have primaries. You know, a few states like Iowa still retain a caucus, but they're fairly rare. And the sort of impetus behind that movement was to democratize the process. And like many reforms that we see in government, the impetus makes sense. The outcome doesn't always match the impetus. And in that case, what has happened is that participation in primaries is very, very low. And so this is an example of one of the electoral reforms people talk about at the state level, because of course the states control our elections for the most part, is moving away from the primary in presidential races, for example. Primaries, while they give people the opportunity to vote, in reality, turnout is very low. And the people who turn out tend to be very extreme or on the extreme ends of their parties. So what do we famously talk about during primaries? Candidates run to the left and the right of their respective parties, and in the general, they run to the middle. If you're able to move to a place where we choose to have another way that parties can choose their nominees, we might mitigate some of that. So that's one example of the type of electoral reform people talk about. Another one, for those of you in Connecticut, many, many years ago, we used to have a party lever. So that would give people the opportunity when they went into the polling booth, and this was back in the day when we still had the lever machines, which we don't anymore, you would have the opportunity to pull a party lever. As a Democrat, you could just pull for Democrats. As a Republican, pull for Republicans. That's mostly gone by the wayside in Connecticut, and most places don't have anything akin to that, right? What that means is that people can split their ballot, right? They can vote for a Republican for president, a Democrat this, Republican this. And what does that do? The reality is it divides the parties in government and makes it harder to get things done. So, and I'm not saying I necessarily would push for any of these, but these are the kinds of reforms that people talk about. The ability, when you go into the polling booth in a state, to choose your president, your senator, and your representative as a ticket. And that again would combine or join their political fortunes, making it more likely they would work together or have an incentive to work together. Those are the kinds of things we're talking about. Whenever we talk about structural reforms, you think about the outcome you want and you structure the system to drive that outcome. So if I wanted an outcome where we were mitigating divisions and government was acting on basic, requests of the majority or supermajority, those would be the kinds of structures you want to think about putting into place. And I mentioned this, but the history of the literature in this area is rich. People have been talking and writing about this for decades, all the way back to the founding. It is not a new problem. It's an old problem that seems to have become all that much more problematic as we've moved into, obviously, 234 years later, when life changes, people change, technology changes, people have different ideas about what they want government to do, and we're still living in a structure designed by people with a very specific purpose that may or may not match what Americans want today.
Thank you. Okay, so we do have a few more questions, and I guess let me know when you when you want to tap out. I'm going to save the chat so I can always send you the questions afterwards, so we could try to respond to them later. But we do have a question from Robert. He says, if you were able to have an amendment, what amendment would you most like passed to improve the system?
Such a good point, Robert. Question. I would be supportive. Number one, I think my sort of bias has been to mitigate the divisions between the executive and legislative branch. So I think an amendment that gets you in that direction, I would probably be supportive of the way, depending on how it was written. So to as I said, allow for the president to appoint those members of the cabinet from the Senate or from the House. It could even be from the House, is one that I think I would be supportive of. So that's sort of one that sort of sticks out in my mind. as sort of a first run in terms of the kinds of amendments I would sort of be drawn to myself. Other people, I think, would be drawn to other things. I mean, the one that I mentioned most popular today, I think amongst many people, doesn't require even a constitutional amendment. It is a rule of the Senate, and that is to get rid of the filibuster. But in turn, and that again is not a constitutional one, that is a rule of the Senate. I also think that we have a real problem with the structure of the Senate that I would be interested in exploring as it pertains to the fact that states that are less populous have an outsized voice in our federal system. And that, I think, is something, and I don't have a solution to it. There's been a lot of ideas thrown out there, but that's also something that I think is worthy of examining. And I would certainly be open to those kinds of things as well. And by the way, I should just say the Electoral College, which the framers was the result of a committee that at the end, when they didn't know how to elect the president, I think that's another example of something that really needs and deserves to be revisited. If you're talking constitutional amendment, that's one that's hard to defend or even explain. I spend a lot of time talking to people from other countries. Try explaining the Electoral College to Americans, let alone somebody in another country. It is such an odd thing to do in a democracy. So that's another one. Has less to do with the divisions, but I think it certainly has to do with this push towards majoritarianism.
Thank you. So it's about 8:10,
Yeah.
and we can keep going, and people can drop off if they want. I don't know, Professor Zaino, what are you thinking?
Well, why don't I could do one more, Jennifer, then I know everybody's been so patient. So and if you could send me the chat, I can try to respond to anything that I missed.
Absolutely. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? Well, you know what? I should have everybody's email addresses in, because they would have signed up for Zoom. So I can probably figure it out, and maybe we can even get them answers. So, all right. So we'll take one more, and this is from Connor, and this is probably a really good question to end on. He wants to know, do you believe that America still has the potential to be the greatest country in the world? Is it now? Was it ever?
Connor, such a good question, and a tough one. Do I believe it can be? Yes. Do I think it is? Yes. Do we have things that we can change about it? Yes. I think the reality is we have problems, we have difficulties, we should be able to resolve them, I hope, peacefully. But I do think that what the framers achieved at the founding, for all the problems associated with it that they talked about, they achieved something historic and remarkable. They achieved something that changed not only all of our lives, but the world. And so I do think that the answer, at least for me, is absolutely yes. And I think if I didn't feel that way, I wouldn't be so passionate about making sure it gets better and better and better. It's almost like your own child, right? If you don't love something, you don't really care what happens to it. But when you love something so much, you want it to succeed and to get better, and you want any of the imperfections corrected. And so I think, it's the height of patriotism to take a sober look at the system and to talk about what's maybe in need of change and evolution, and to try to address that. So Connor, I thank you, but my answer is yes on all of those fronts.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Zaino, for such a stimulating conversation tonight. And I can tell by the really thoughtful questions that all of us really got a lot out of. Your passionate and eloquent case, and I'm feeling a little bit more patriotic tonight. I hope everyone else is too. Thank you so much. We will have a recording of this available. We can send it out to everyone who registered for this, and then we'll also be putting it on a YouTube channel, so I'm we'll have it out on social media and we'll give you a copy as well, Professor Zaino, so that you can get it out to your network as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Happy Constitution Day. And I look forward to going back to Noah Webster House. It's a tremendous place. And plus my mom worked there for years. Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks you everyone for listening to me on a Tuesday night.
Goodbye, teacher. Have a good night.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you to all my students who came.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good night.
Good night.
Very welcome.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, Professor. See you.
Bye. Thank you.